Good morning, everyone. My name's Tom Barton. I'm a professor of history at University of San Diego, and I'm filling in for Lisa Fagan Davis, who unfortunately, much to regret, couldn't be here to moderate this very exciting, much anticipated webinar uh, uh, on Christian Muslim Jewish relations and Middle Ages. I'm very happy to be able to host this exciting conversation between Sara Lipton and Hussein Fancy. I'm sure all of you know, Hussein Fancy is associate professor of history at Yale University, and his research and writing focus on economic, social, legal, and intellectual history of medieval Europe and Islamic world, particularly interactions between Jews, Christians, Muslims in the medieval Mediterranean. And Sara Lipton is professor and chair of history at Stony Brook University, and then just finishing her incredibly executed presidential term of the Medieval Academy of America as well. Her main fields of interest are Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations, Christian and anti-Judaism, and the visual culture in the Central and later Middle Ages. She also writes for the broader public about religious and ethnic intolerance, religious politics, and the role of social media. And I'm very happy to be moderating this, and so I will hand over the mic to I believe Sara, you were going to be going first, and then I will be moderating once it comes time for Q&A and kind of discussion following the things they're going to present.
Um, Thank you so much, Tom. And I should say really a special thanks because we only asked Tom to moderate this yesterday. So he's really stepping into the breach and we appreciate it. I'm going to say just a few words of introduction, then I'm going to let Hussein say a few words of introduction, then I'm going to go and show you some images and texts too quickly. I'm sure you'll say too quickly. I will slow down and answer questions at the Q&A if you want. And then Hussein will do the same. And then we really want to have a conversation both between the two of us and also among all of you who are joining us, who might have questions or comments. The first thing I think both Hussein and I wanted to say is that neither of us consider ourselves experts in the topic at hand as advertised Jewish-Muslim relations. I teach Jewish Christian Muslim relations. I have written mostly on Christian Jewish relations with more emphasis on the Christian sources than the Jewish sources. But having said that, my own university has very vibrant Muslim and Jewish, as well as Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, and many other religious traditions among our student populations, but very little structure for them to engage in shared conversation or learning experiences. So, current world events, the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Gaza war, the concomitant rise of both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia has, in my view, intensified the need for educators and scholars to offer background and context. So I've been doing a lot more work on Jewish-Muslim relations, incorporating lectures and texts and images into a variety of courses above and beyond my kind of bread and butter course on Jewish-Muslim relations. My argument that I give to the students and that you'll see throughout my very short presentation is that although we often hear that people are naturally suspicious of or hostile towards those who are different, every human being in the world is different from every other human being in the world. And every other human being in the world is similar to many other human beings in the world. Some of us are tall, short, dark, fair, artistic, athletic, etc. And each society, culture, period decides which aspects of our shared differences and similarities are significant. And I always try to impress upon students, general public audiences, that although our society, like many others, but not all others, has decided that religion, ethnicity, race, and/or nationality are significant, attitudes towards people with those differences are hardly pre-programmed or universal or static. They arise out of a complex interplay of discourse, rhetoric, words, images, symbols, and very real material, economic, political circumstances. And the alleged differences repeatedly break down upon close examination. In general, what I tend to urge is that medieval Christians, Jews, Muslims, and pagans were often considerably less completely different from each other than polemic and rhetoric seem to suggest. But that does not mean that we tell a happy story. Jewish-Christian-Muslim relations have varied wildly from time to time. Often they were very tense in spite of, sometimes as a result of, the similarities. But the main argument I try to make as an unabashed proponent for tolerance and coexistence and peace is that people have a choice. So really, it's not a subtle presentation that I give in my scholarship or in my teaching. And that's kind of all the preface I wanted to give now. I'll let Hussein say a few words and then go back and share some images and texts.
Thanks, Sarah. That's so lovely. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. Sarah and I have done this in a few different kinds of settings. And our goal really isn't to speak to experts, and many of you are experts out there. It really is an opportunity to introduce some vocabulary, have a conversation, maybe inspire you to speak to broader publics as well. Why don't we just roll out the show and see what happens? And after both Sarah and I talk, I'm principally going to be talking about Christian views of Muslims. We'll move on to Q&A, a conversation between the two of us in which we will, I think, address Jewish-Muslim relations directly. I have some thoughts on that as well, but yeah, let's see how it goes. I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, so I should share my screen. Yes. Okay, that looks like that worked. Thumbs up from Tom and Hussein to make sure you can see this. All right, great, terrific, thank you. All right, so I'm going to be discussing texts from 9th century Syria, 11th century Apulia, 11th and 12th century Egypt, 12th century Morocco, 12th century Andalusia and Christian Spain, 13th century Christian Castile, 14th century Catalonia. I will be showing Jewish texts and images. And let's get started. I try to have a box, as you see here, providing the credit, whether it's for an image or for a text. I do want to just, when I teach this or speak to the general public, tiny bit of background. I'm not going to give you the historical background that I try to give, but I just show a map here. This is Jews, the geographical distribution of Jews in the Roman Empire before the fall of the Roman Empire in the West and the gradual morphing of the Roman Empire in the East, to show that Jews were spread around the Mediterranean region and quite deeply into the North African coast, into Iberia, into Italy, and up into the Balkans and Gaul. And then I show them a map of Jews under Muslim rule, really to make the point, obviously, first of all, to show the spread of Muslim rule, but also to make the point that Muslims found Jewish communities where they went. And then also there was migration within Muslim lands as well as between Christian and Muslim lands by Jews during the course of the Middle Ages. So just to give an idea of the geographical range and obviously, therefore, the cultural differences that we see among Jewish communities in the Middle Ages. Again, some key points that I try to make, not new to any medievalists, I assume, but worth making, that throughout the medieval period, Jews were under either Christian or Muslim rule. Christian and Muslim authorities developed similar frameworks, sometimes called Augustinian tolerance, although that's not always accurate. I tend to emphasize the precedent of Roman law and text by Pope Gregory in promoting tolerance of a certain kind for Jews among Christian lands, Dhimma status, which I assume Hussein will talk about, in Muslim lands. So the status is often called tolerated, sometimes protected, but always with an understanding that Jews acknowledged their subordination to Christian or Muslim rule. How that subordinate status was actually realized, how it was imposed, enforced, or displayed, varied widely, I would even say wildly, from not at all or barely to onerously from time to time, place to place. Obviously, basic rule that historians, scholars know, but we want to share with general audiences and students. Pay attention to who wrote the texts and who made the images. Authors don't control reception, but it's still worth knowing, so we can understand the point of view, the rhetoric, the bias, the spin. I always like to emphasize that not just Christian and Muslim authorities, but Jewish authorities too, all sought to preserve religious distinctiveness in some way of some kind, often through erecting social barriers. It's not that Jews wanted desperately, or Jewish authorities wanted desperately to assimilate and they were prevented from. I mean, much of rabbinic law is designed to actually erect fences between Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors. Obviously, another point, chronicles and polemics tend to focus on moments of conflict and change. Quotidian life often appears in the sources only obliquely, if at all, so a lot of reading between the lines is necessary. Again, basic points for scholars, but worth reiterating when you teach this and when you share it with members of the general public. Let me see. Okay, so my first text, this is a text written by a Muslim, actually. I said I was sharing Jewish texts, but this is written by a Muslim, al-Baraduri, in a text that is now known as The Conquests of the Land. He lived in the 9th century, but he is describing the conquest of the city of Homs in modern-day Syria, a joint Jewish-Christian city of Homs that had been under Byzantine rule, and he's describing the context in the first half of the 7th century, around 638 of the Common Era, by Muslim forces coming out of Arabia. So again, just to, I don't want to read it all, but I want to highlight that this had been under Byzantine rule. The Byzantine emperor gathered his troops. Muslims learned that the Byzantines were advancing upon them to do battle. They gave battle to the people of Homs, the city. They had taken tribute from them, or they returned the tribute they had taken and said, we're too busy to aid and defend you. So the people of Homs felt abandoned by the army of Syria. The people of Homs, also called Hims, replied, oh, no, I'm sorry. The Muslims had taken tribute from the people of Homs. They had passed through, taken tribute, returned, and the people of Homs replied to the Muslim military commander, we prefer your rule and your justice to the oppression and injustice of the Byzantines. And in fact, the Byzantines had, since the reign of Justinian, been imposing more and more restrictions on Jewish existence in the Byzantine world. So the Jews rose up and said, by the Torah, Heraclius's governor shall not enter the city of Homs unless we are utterly vanquished. So the Jews locked the gates of the city and set guard over them. The people of other cities in Syria, Christians and Jews, who had submitted to the Muslims already, did likewise. Saying, if the Byzantines are victorious over the Muslims, then we shall return to our former state, meaning a state of subjugation. But if the Muslims are victorious, we shall retain control over our affairs. And I should mention that the Christians in this case are not Greek Orthodox Christians, but Syriac Christians, Nestorians, Monophysites, Christian confessions that had been persecuted by Byzantines as well. So one obvious point that this text is making and that we can draw from it is that not only did Jews seem to prefer Muslim rule, Muslims had promised autonomy and had returned tribute that they had originally taken, but that there were divisions among Christian communities and tensions between local Syrian Christian communities and Byzantine communities. So that's just one view of the kinds of complicated relations that we see throughout the Middle Ages. And again, something that I tend to emphasize on a regular basis is that even small minority communities are not monolithic. Just as the Christians were not unified under Byzantine rule, so in fact Jews were not necessarily entirely unified under any rule. There were class differences, there were professional differences, there were differences of Jews from different backgrounds who practiced different liturgical traditions. There are Jews who followed what we would call rabbinical Judaism, the Talmud. There were Jews who rejected the authority of the Talmud. So nothing as simple as one of the few kind of reliable conclusions we can draw. This is just an image of the city of Homs that gives an idea of the ancient citadel up upon, of course, that hilltop. Skipping ahead to 11th century Apulia, southern Italy, there is a Hebrew chronicle known as the Book of Genealogies. It was compiled by a man who identified himself, Achimaas ben Patil, from the 11th century. He was known as kind of a Greco-Italian Jewish poet from an illustrious Jewish family that claimed it had lived in Italy since the 1st century of the Common Era. This is basically a family history, a book of genealogies in which he tells the story of his own family, mostly through family traditions. But along the way, it provides really interesting information about larger political, military, cultural events. And in this passage I'm sharing here, he describes the Muslim conquest of this region of Sicily and southern Italy in the middle of the first half of the 10th century. And I just want to see that he calls them Arabians, so I identifies them by their alleged place of origin, although by the middle of the 10th century, Muslims might come from anywhere, not just the Arabian Peninsula. The Jews had been under Byzantine rule at this point. So the Jews were living under Christians and they see these Muslims arriving. He calls it an invasion with armies. They are overrunning the borders of the kingdom of the uncircumcised being, of course, Christians, in this case, Byzantine Christians, a distinctly unflattering label when applied by a Jew to another peoples, as is the country of the idolaters. Jews do not label Christians idolaters in all times and places in the Middle Ages, but they do in quite a few times and places in the Middle Ages. But this is also not a text flattering to the Muslims. So unlike the Jews of Homs, according to al-Baladuri, the Jews of 11th century Italy did not welcome the Muslim invaders. And he uses words like destruction, devastation. They raised the defensive walls. They attacked the inhabitants in force. And then he goes on to tell a particular family memory that there was in Bari, a chieftain of the Arabians who held sway over the entire country. He sent messengers to the famous city of Oria, where Paltil's family came from, to make a treaty of peace with its inhabitants, promising not to destroy it. But according to Achimaas ben Paltil, this was just a ruse, this promise not to destroy the city, but he actually planned to fall upon the city and overthrow it and lay it to waste. And then he goes on to tell at greater length than I wanted to take here, a family legend that a Jewish community leader named Harav Shefachtiach was able, by writing magical letters onto his horse's hoof, to miraculously travel from Bari to Oria, to get to Oria before sundown on Shabbat, so he wasn't breaking, of course, the ban on traveling during Shabbat, so that he could warn the inhabitants of the city, both Christian and Jewish, that the Muslims were planning to attack. And then he goes on to say, when the rabbi reached the outskirts of the city, he called on all the residents of the city to flee to the outer city, warned them that the Arabians were planning to kill, rob, and plunder. He drew near the Byzantine Christian governor of the city. They met, they talked, they took counsel. The implication is they have good relations at this time. Then having talked to the governor and warned him, the rabbi washed, bathed, welcomed the Sabbath as was fitting. Very clearly, Achimaas is making the point that this is a Jew who observes all Jewish law. And he says that this Jew basically saved his city because the Muslim commander found the city deserted and was unable to kill anybody. And here is the translation of the Chronicle of Achimaas, a very interesting source for anyone who wants to consult it. Here is just a photograph of the city of Oria in Apulia, a hilltop town, which was quite heavily fortified through much of the Middle Ages. Another very, very interesting source, which I like to teach with when I teach the Crusades. On the right, it is a letter found in the famous Geniza, the room where all sorts of documents from the Jewish community of Cairo, from the early Middle Ages through the 17th century, were basically thrown away, but so as not to have to destroy them in any way. Geniza means treasury, but it was really just a kind of a sealed up trash room. It's a letter written apparently in July 1099 And before we look at the text, I just want to notice that on the left here, I have an image. Oh, and I should have given credit shared with me by my wonderful colleague, Mohammed Balan, of a talismanic scroll, a Muslim scroll with Quranic verses on it, but also the Seal of Solomon. I shared this in my recent address that I gave at the Medieval Academy to indicate the extent to which Jews and Muslims shared a visual culture, a symbolic culture, and as we will see, also literary cultures and languages and philosophy, which again doesn't always make for a very happy story, but sometimes in fact does. So on the right is an image of part of the manuscript that the letter comes from. And here is, part of the text of the letter in a typescript. It has been published by S.D. Goitein in the Journal of Jewish Studies in 1952. This letter was written by a Jew, apparently a resident of North Africa, Fatimid ruled North Africa, who had been spending several years, perhaps as many as 5 years in Egypt, first in Alexandria and then in Cairo doing business. And he hoped before he concluded his business and went back home to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but he was prevented from doing so by the arrival of the Franks in the area of Jerusalem. And so he describes here, however, when God, however, had given, and of course, maybe not of course, but Jerusalem had gone back and forth in terms of who controlled it between Fatimids, between Fatimid Muslim rivals, between Byzantine rulers. And briefly, the Fatimid ruler had gotten control of Jerusalem again. So he starts here at the top, when God had given Jerusalem, the blessed, into his hands, meaning the Fatimid sultan's hands. This state of affairs, meaning it was under Fatimid rule, for too short a time to allow me to make a journey there, because then the Franks arrived and killed everyone in the city, whether of Ishmael or of Israel. That's how he's distinguishing Muslims from Jews. And of course, that is confirmed by Crusader chronicles that also say they killed everyone in the city. And the very few who survived the slaughter were made prisoners. Some of these have been ransomed since, while others are still in captivity in all parts of the world. Now, all of us had anticipated that our Sultan, may God bestow glory upon his victories, would set out against them, the Franks, with his troops and chase them away. But time after time, our hope failed. Yet to this very present moment, we hope that God will give the Sultan's enemies into his hands. We have no evidence that this Jew actually made it to Jerusalem. But again, the interesting aspect of this that we could emphasize is that this Jew calls the Sultan our Sultan. He prays for his victory. Is he doing so because he feels that it's safer to do so, because he feels it very sincerely, because the Sultan is the best of a bad deal? This is something that we like to discuss, but certainly there is an affiliation, a sense of connection to or belonging to Fatimid rule by this Jewish resident of North Africa. Here is an image of another text from the Geniza, something I only learned about recently because I read this an article. I'll identify the source of the article. Extremely interesting. This fragment is actually 13th century, but it reproduces fragments of some poems by a 12th century Muslim Sufi poet. And again, these translations and everything I know about this is owed to Nathaniel Miller from this article published very recently, 2 years ago, in the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies. There are fragments of 3 different Sufi poems by Al-Kizani, the somewhat heterodox Sufi poet. I won't read them all, but the first one, labor for your soul, where the bow of your life runs with sap, then go to your final end when you have become dust in the earth, and be content, for you will be happy so long as you are content with lowliness. And just to share with you what Nathaniel Miller says about these 3 different poems, his commentary, the first poem, blends advice, ascetic values, and wisdom. And it is worth noting that the end of life is not referenced in order to invoke paradise or really any religious concept, but is simply there as a recognition of the transient nature of earthly existence. The second poem expresses a typical Sufi valorization of the love of God without having any uniquely Muslim aspects to it. The third poem, like the first, again, is a valorization of the concept of qana'a, or contentment. And overall, Miller's conclusion is that Jews read the poems of the Sufi al-Kizani because he was not dogmatically Muslim, and that's one of the reasons he got in trouble with some Sunni authorities. There is essentially no Islamic content to the poems that are found in the Geniza fragments, other than one very subtle and quite general Quranic allusion. There is no reference to Muhammad or his prophecy, or to Ibn al-Kizani's kalam, the unorthodoxy of which we hear from other sources, which in Miller's view seems to indicate a pool of common Near Eastern pious idioms available to readers of any monotheistic religion in Egypt in this period, while still revealing considerable discomfort with the idea that anyone even copying down poems might be mistaken for someone who has sympathy with Islam as a religion. So again, kind of subtle similarity, difference, friendship, hostility. None of these stories are easy. Here I'm sharing images that also I shared in my recent address at the Medieval Academy, again, to show you cultural similarities, which don't necessarily dictate close relations, friendship, religious tolerance as the contemporary world would understand it. On the right, there's a sketch of a stele from Saleh in Morocco, probably 12th century, and this was a Muslim burial ground, using again the Seal of Solomon, better known these days as the Star of David, with the Muslim crescent in between, so kind of a hybrid or syncretic image, we might think. And then on the left, there is a Haggadah from early 14th century Castile. So that's a Jewish text written in Hebrew in Christian Castile, showing almost the identical symbol, the maybe Muslim crescent, the star that's an astrological sign, and the so-called Seal of Solomon or Star of David. No conclusions to be drawn, except that there were common shared symbols, which might have been interpreted in very different, sometimes opposing ways, but don't necessarily have to be. Going back in time a little bit, a very famous poem, I haven't shared a source for this because it is reproduced in English and Hebrew and many other languages in so many places. All you have to do is Google Judah Halevi or Yehuda Halevi. My heart is in the east. It's a very beautiful poem. My heart is in the east, and I am at the edge of the west. How can I savor what I eat? How find it sweet? How can I fulfill my vows and obligations while Zion is in the fetter of Edom and I in Arab chains? So this sounds like Zionist longing, a deeply pious Jew, pox on both their houses, we might think, neither Christians nor Arabs. Edom was a medieval Jewish shorthand for referring to Christians. Both of them in chain and fetter and prison, keep Jews captive. But then again, he says, it would be easy for me to leave all the goodness of Spain. It would be dear to my eyes to see the dust of the ruined sanctuary. So in fact, there is goodness and sweetness in Spain. And Yehuda Halevi, in fact, was a Jewish poet, physician, and philosopher, born in Tudela when it was under Muslim rule in 1075, moved to Granada for a while when it was under Muslim rule. Then after all, the Almoravid invasion from North Africa, which brought a wave of intolerance towards non-Muslims, he moved up into Christian Toledo, and then went to Muslim-controlled Egypt, and then filled his heart's desire and started it on the journey to Jerusalem. He died somewhere along the way in 1141. We don't know if it was in Alexandria or Ashkelon, or whether he made it to Jerusalem. So again, a lot of ambivalence here. Iberia is very, very sweet, but Christians and Jews in prison, Christians and Muslims in prison, Jews, and Zion is the actual home. Just an image that might illustrate, it's from a later century, but is this an image of all the goodness of Spain? This is from a famous manuscript made for Alfonso el Sabio of Castile in 1283, probably in Sevilla, El Libro de los Juegos, the Book of Games, showing on the left a Jew in a hat and on the right a Muslim in a turban. amicably, presumably, playing chess together. Is this convivencia? Is this a Christian king commissioning an idealized version of two peoples over whom he ruled? There are many ways to interpret this, and it's certainly an image that and a manuscript that allows lots of room for discussion. And then I'll end with just one more image that is maybe one of the most enigmatic of all. And of course, that was a Christian image I should have mentioned. This is from a Hebrew manuscript, perhaps illuminated by a Hebrew illuminator and nator, perhaps by a Christian illuminator, a Haggadah, so the book for the Seder meal, showing the part of the ritual where four sons, a wise, a simple, a wicked, and then on the next page, a son who does not know how to ask, asking questions about why Jews are reading the Haggadah aloud at the Seder. And we have here illustrations of the wise son, shown as an elderly, bearded philosopher type. And this is the wicked son, shown, I think we have to interpret it as a Muslim warrior from North Africa with dark skin, with a distinctive curved scimitar and round shield of Muslim fighters in this period. And there is a lot of debate among scholars, no firm consensus as to why Jews living in Christian Catalonia would show the wicked son as a Muslim. On the one hand, to even call him a son indicates a certain acknowledgement of closeness, of kinship. On the other hand, to call him wicked, is that a way of denigrating Muslims? Is the darkened skin a way of othering, to use a term I don't love, but which is widely accepted, Muslims? It is very hard to say. It does seem the Muslim here represents aggression and military affairs, and that would have been quite different from the Jewish communities that would have commissioned a Haggadah in 14th century Barcelona, who were largely urban dwellers and merchants. The owner of this book would have been very well off, which meant that he probably had some kind of relations with Christian elites. Does this sign of a Muslim warrior as a wicked son show that this elite Jew has sees himself as a colonizer, sees himself as identifying with the Christian rulers in some way, or is this maybe a way again of showing the ambivalence towards Christians and Muslims? I'm not going to give answers. I'm going to stop there and end in the best rabbinical fashion with all those questions.
Thank you, Sarah. That was so great. I have lots of questions and lots of thoughts to follow up with, but let me share what I wanted to begin with today. And it's really it's a jumping off point for our discussion after this. I wanted to start, let me share my screen as well. Does that work for everybody? It should just be black at this point. I wanted to start in the way that Angelica Newerth sometimes starts her lectures, which I appreciate, which is by trying to define Islam itself. And that may be helpful. Maybe some of you aren't experts in this topic, and it's useful to start in the mire and sort of in the beginning and in the most complex kinds of evidence we have. It's useful to remember, for instance, that early Muslims didn't refer to themselves as Muslims. They referred to themselves as mu'minun, the believers. They referred to themselves as the muhajirun, the exiles. And already in that word, the exiles, you get a sense of how they may have situated themselves in this world, not as a different group, not as a group that, not as another religion or even confession are the words we often use to describe these groups, but rather in the midst of something, maybe even echoing Jews and Judaism. It's also helpful to start, if we're thinking about the Quran as our primary and main evidence for what early Muslims thought they were doing, or let's just call them the followers of Muhammad. We might start with the Quran itself, the text. What is this thing? Quran, as many of you might know, isn't an Arabic word, it's a Syriac word, which is a fascinating thing to begin with. It's a word that would have been used by Christians at the time. It means the recitation. It isn't a Bible, it isn't a covenant, it isn't a narrative text, it is understood as a liturgical text to some degree, and each saw itself in relationship to the Bible, and that's clear if anyone were to read the Quran. Let's do that though. Let's look at what is typically seen as the Islamic credo, as the sort of confession of Islam, and read it together. Say, he is God, one. God upon whom all depend, but depends on none. He begets not, nor is he begotten, and none is like him. Very short, very simple. There's a lot in there already. There's a statement of monotheism. There's almost a curious Aristotelianism in that second line. There's something rather polemical in that third line. He begets not, nor is he begotten, obviously speaking to Christians. And none is like him. Another interesting statement of monotheism, and another almost philosophical statement. This is my translation, by the way. There are lots of different ways in which this is rendered. As you see the word in the second line in Arabic, as-samadu doesn't also have a great Arabic root. It might mean something like rock, but I'm translating it rather liberally in as a kind of Greek term that's working its way into Arabic. But as Angelica Neuwirth likes to point out, and I think it's very true, that this Surat al-Ikhlas, if we take it as the credo of Islam, is very clearly a reference to the Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. It has that same structure. Say, he is God, one. Hear, he is God, one. Even more interesting than that is that last word in Arabic. The first line reads, Kul huwa Allahu ahadun. Those of you who have a little bit of Arabic know that ahadun is not how you say one in Arabic. It is how you say first. It's very clear. I mean, one way to think about this is that the Arabic of the Quran is polyglot, and we have a Hebrew word here that's made its way into the Quran, ahad, ahad. All this is to say that when we're speaking about Islam, we need to keep some of this subtext in mind. Muslims have this as a substratum as they come to define themselves against Christians and Jews in later periods. They also have a challenge to some degree about the tradition they bear with them. It's close intimacy with Christianity and Judaism. This comes up even in the early Islamic conquests, as Sarah was saying. The very first thing Muslims do when they conquer Jerusalem is rebuild the Temple of Solomon, hence the kind of Solomonic reference throughout history. They see themselves as doing something in a Jewish tradition very much. And it's fair, I think, to even say early Muslims see themselves as Judeo-Christians to some degree. And that might help us get towards maybe a world that we can speak of in more confessional or religious terms. Those words might be useful, but they have a history in and of themselves. There's lots for us to talk about. There's lots for us to talk about in terms of Jewish-Muslims relations, and I'm happy to talk about that. I wanted to give you, as a starting off point, the very traditional ways in which Christians, or the way historians at least, have talked about the way Christians think about Muslims in the Middle Ages. This also helps us, I think, give us some language about how Muslims thought about Christians, and also a little bit about how Muslims thought about Jews and Jews differently than Christians. But all three of them are in an intimate conversation, as the Quran lets us know. There were essentially two ways in which medieval Christians thought about Muslims. I'm trying to make this very simple, but at the end, I'm going to add a variation to this. It's coming out of a book I'm writing as well. The first is to think or imagine Islam as a kind of idol worship itself, based on the model of Rome, or perhaps the Jews of Exodus. Christians here see Islam as a kind of pure politics, a carnality, even an excessive form of violence, void of any religious context. Here we are in a 13th century Hereford map. I'm sure you all use it in class. In the section which depicts the Exodus cycle, we have Jews worshiping the golden calf. And if we look very closely, I've kept it sort of black and white and the color together. I don't know which one is easier to read, but the inscription above the idol that is being worshipped by Jews is Mahum, Muhammad. It's an interesting conflation of these moments, and Jews, Muslims, and Christians are coming together in the way they are thinking together. Another good example, and thanks to Sarah for giving me this image and correcting my reference here, is the very famous William of Tyre's Histoire d'Outre-mer, History of the Crusades. Here we have on the top left, Jews crucifying Christ, and on the bottom right, Muslims in present-day Jerusalem worshiping an idol. And I think, Sarah, I want you to think about this with me maybe afterwards. The Muslims are wearing the Jewish hats, which is kind of interesting. But the juxtaposition of Muslims worshiping an idol, and that idol is Muhammad. So Muslims are seen as somehow in relationship to Jews, ongoing the injustice of Jews, Jews of a certain kind of stripe as kind of a pagan worshippers. Muhammad is understood here as an idol, sometimes as three idols. There's a kind of anti-trinity in the way Muslims are depicted. The other way Christians seem to think about Muslims in this period, and again, this has been written about extensively by people like John Toland, is as a heresy, that Islam is an imposter religion, a splinter version of Christianity. It looks so much like Christianity, indeed it does. How do we make sense of it? One way of making sense of it was to speak of it as heresy, as another form of Arianism, which indeed does share a lot in ideas in common with Islam. Has inspired this connection between Arianism and Islam, has inspired a great deal of dubious scholarship. For some, this narrative has even turned the other way. The idea that Islam is a splinter version of Christianity in the 16th and 17th century lends it a kind of authenticity that Catholicism doesn't have. And that's an interesting, branch along the history of Christian views of Islam. Again, this tradition intersects with Christian views of Judaism as something dangerous, as something tempting, as dissuading Christians from the true way. We see it in Boccaccio, including this image I've given you, of Muhammad as the preacher, who's as a kind of magician and a conjurer. And most famously, we see it in Canto 28 of Dante's Inferno, where Muhammad is literally being rended open, torn in half. He is among the schismatics, rendered kind of beautifully and awfully. The way Yaroslav Pelikan once described this to me in a beautiful lecture that I attended as a very young student was that Dante sees himself as walking a tightrope over heaven and hell, following the path of Muhammad up to this moment where Muhammad falls off. What's interesting to me, and I think what I want to point out is interesting to you and intersects partly with what, or a great deal with what Sarah is saying, is that both these ideas persist at the same time in the Christian tradition. I'm giving you a lot of 13th century ideas because that's really my wheelhouse. Why is it that Christians are simultaneously depicted as having no religion, being pagans, and then at the same time depicted as being heretics, as being a lot like Christians, dangerously so? How do those things coexist? It's also worth pointing out that we're not so far from holding these views of Muslims. The Supreme Court, we have an image of Muhammad as a secular lawgiver, more or less, a sword bearer. I mean, this is an absurd image, but it was meant to be a compliment at the time. I might, those of you, I didn't include any images of this, but I teach Jack Chick, who claims to be the most successful author in all of history. He's sold over 1 million copies of his books about Islam. He writes, comic books that are circulated through Christian evangelical circles about Islam that also carry on some of these tropes. And I guess the question for me is, why does the pagan image of Islam survive when Christians become more and more knowledgeable over time in the context of Islam? And certainly in Western Europe, by the 13th century, we've already passed through Peter the Venerable. We've already passed through figures who've translated the Quran, who've studied the Quran, who know Arabic. We have plenty of evidence of this. Why do they insist on speaking of Islam as paganism right through this period? Part of the answer, part of the problem, I think, can be understood by going back to the image in Dante of the rended Muhammad opening up his heart and showing it to Dante as he's passing through. This is actually an image drawn from the Islamic tradition itself. Muhammad's heart is opened by an angel and cleaned for him at his death. Might also look again at this William of Tyre image, which depicts Islam as a form of paganism in the bottom right. If we read the text below, the text says, Muslims believe in Mary and in God. And so the text and the image seem to be in conflict with one another. And there's two ideas. Islam is a heresy. Islam is a form of Christianity. Islam is an imposter. Christianity exists in very intimate relationship here on the page, where the artist who drew the image and the scribe who wrote the text were right next to each other, but seemingly holding different views of Islam. Let me take you away from things you might notice, something that you probably don't know, but I'm writing about, which is a very obscure image of Muhammad, or Mahomet, as he's called, in the Aula Gotica, which is held in the monastic complex of Santi Quattro Cornati in Rome. I want to be brief here. I have, 1,000 hours of material on this, but the Aula Gotica, interestingly, was the private residence of the Cardinal Stefano Conti. Stefano Conti was the nephew of Innocent III, who was also the vice-regent. He controlled Rome in Innocent's absence during the assault of Frederick Barbarossa on Rome. The Aula itself is an expansive and vaulted hall. It's about 17.3, or it's exactly 17.3 meters long, 9 meters wide, 11 meters tall. It was once the vestry of this monastery, which still functions. It's very difficult to get access to. It was accidentally, during a renovation of the vestry, discovered to be this incredibly well decorated place. It has some of the earliest images, or has the earliest images of St. Francis in it. I only discovered in the 80s, I believe. Images once covered every surface of the walls here, the vaults. The Aula Gotica itself is divided in two parts. It is divided down the half into northern and southern halves. And here we are looking at the northern half, and the Muhammad is right in the far corner. The southern half of the wall depicted, which we're not looking at, depicted all the elements of human knowledge. And the northern half depicted all the elements of divine knowledge. And it's here that we find Muhammad. Why is he here, and what is he doing? Muhammad is cowering, as you can see, beneath the image of a female warrior who is sobriety. On her shoulder, she carries the prophet Daniel, the one who refused to eat at Nebuchadnezzar's table. Sobriety carries a scroll that reads Victum et Vestitus, food and clothing. This is an abbreviation from Deuteronomy 10:18-20. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. Beneath the warrior are two figures, one female, one male. The female is Luxuria. She carries a scroll that reads, Comedamos et bibamos, let us eat and drink, from Isaiah. Muhammad is depicted as a beardless youth holding up his hands in desperation. Now, the question I have for you or for us is, why is Muhammad here the opposite of sobriety? Why is he associated with eating and drinking in this text? Why luxury? Why is he an epicure like the Jews mentioned in Isaiah? Why is he not placed, say, beneath true religion? The exact figure there under true religion can't be identified, but is labeled a Pharisee. Why is he not opposite or beneath the fear of God? That's Alexander the Great. Why is he not the opposite of divine love? That's Julian the Apostate. Why is he not opposite or beneath divine emulation? That is Simon Magus. Why is he not underneath conquered? That is the famous heresiarch Arius that Muslims were associated. Why is Muhammad associated with excess? The answer, I think, is to be understood partly by looking at the chamber as a whole. As a whole, it represents all the knowledge man can obtain in this life, both secular and divine. The secular knowledge listed here is astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, music, grammar. These are all in the 13th century forms of science that are flooding into the papal and imperial courts through translators working with Arabic texts. One need only think, for instance, of the Kitab al-Sir wal-Israr, translated as the Secretum Secretorum by Michael Scott, which was initially believed to be a text of Aristotle. This text connected medicine, philosophy, and astrology to good governance. All these ideas, without belaboring the details, I would say, or without showing you too much of the evidence, are about a turn in the way kings and popes imagined themselves in the 13th century as possessing a kind of sapiential knowledge. Many scholars have said this kind of evidence, popes translating Arabic, speaks to a surprising openness they had towards Greek and Arabic philosophy and science. But I think we might read this differently, as saying to these people, how can we consume the secular goods of the Islamic world without becoming consumed by Islam itself? The Muhammad of the Aula Gotica, I want to tell you or suggest, represents a movement, a kind of variation on the theme of paganism in a minor key. It is an effort to tame Muhammad and Islam as they spilled into the landscape of Rome and Europe in the 13th century. One reason why pagan Islam continued to survive into the 13th century is because it helped to tame and soften the threat of Islam as something else, as something that might overwhelm or become Christianity itself. If Muhammad was the heresiarch, torn in half for eternity in Dante's Inferno as a punishment for dividing believers, the painters of the Aula Gotica have divided Islam, I think, in a very different way. They have divided him, oops, look at that, I stopped sharing my keynote. And they've divided him in a different way, in an equally polemical way, I think, which is secular and sacred, in a way that I think we continue to do. There is an Islam of a religion and there is an Islam of a culture. At least in the 13th century, the secularization of Islam was part of the process of coming to terms with it, of devouring it, of making sense with it, of it. Okay, thank you. I think that's what I had as a start for a conversation. Sarah, what do you think? Should we chat for a few minutes and then let people see how we hang out and chat and then take some questions?
Sure. Let's chat for just a few minutes and make sure we have time for questions. I mean,
Yeah.
so far I see just one, but it's possible more will come. One of the things I know that you and I have been talking about for, gosh, a decade or two now, I mean, what you touched upon throughout, your remarks, parallels or divergences between Christian images of Jews or Muslims. And, this is something that I tried to touch upon when I was asked to write the chapter on Christianity and its religious others for the Oxford Handbook of Christianity. And there, I mean, I didn't know about the Aula Gotica, and I'm just so grateful to you for putting it on my radar screen and teaching me about it.
What's so interesting, to interrupt you for a second, is that they make it next to impossible to see because they're so worried about people talking about it.
Yeah, well, one would hope that these sensitivities did not continue into the 21st century, but if anything, maybe they're getting worse. It's true, but I mean, one of the things that I sort of touched upon without going into it in any depth in that chapter is that although, yes, I mean, the standard saying that the representation of the other is to create, to echo the title of my last book, a distorted or a dark mirror of oneself, what one does not want to be, what one should not be, what one likes to think oneself is not. It doesn't mean that these groups were interchangeable, so that yes, Jews and Muslims were constructed in Christian imagery and rhetoric as materialistic, as carnal, but the rhetoric tended not to completely violate reality or common everyday experience, so that Jews and Muslims are both carnal and material, but not always in exactly the same ways. And what I did find is that although if you go back to the 4th century, the very well-known anti-Jewish or maybe anti-Judaizing Christian homilies of John Chrysostom talks about Jews being gluttonous and drunkards. that does not really find its way into high and later medieval rhetoric. It just, I mean, Jews were not constructed as gluttonous and drunkards by Christian polemicists who focused instead on their alleged financial activities or their alleged inability to read scripture and other things spiritually, on maybe their physical luxury in terms of clothing related to their wealth, but not really in terms of their eating and drinking practices. Whereas we do see a lot of emphasis on Muslims being drunken and gluttonous. And I think that both relates to the idea of the Muslim lands really being just incredibly luxurious, comfortable, enticing, you know, cultures and the sources of spices and all good things that taste good. It's also an allegation of hypocrisy. I mean, they basically knew that Muslims did not drink alcohol, and so the best way to label someone a hypocrite is to say they do what they pretend not to do, right?
Oh, but they definitely do. We have lots of
Right,
evidence.
well, that also, but to what extent Christians acknowledge that, not always completely clear. So not everything is identical, although they do serve the same purposes, which is to construct Jews and Muslims as what Christians should not be.
Yeah.
Carnal.
I mean, I think, what's so interesting about, I think one of the resonances between the arguments that we're making is that lots and lots of knowledge of Jews and Judaism, lots of knowledge of Islam and Muslims does not mean barriers break down. And that's one really good and useful lesson for students. That some, kind of like a liberal sense of toleration and getting to know each other and conversation is going to solve all our problems. We have a great model to some degree of the Middle Ages of how far thoughtful, smart, interesting, well-studied, even linguistically proficient people can go out of their way to be awful. And that's an interesting lesson for them, the kind of deep perversion. I think, you're absolutely right that, the great example of this for me is Peter the Chanter speaking of Jewish usurers as Christians, right? His first reference to Jewish usurers as not to actually Jewish people, is to Christians behaving like Jews. And I think in that context, he really means Jewish readings of the Bible and not Jewish people. We don't have any good evidence, I believe, of actual Jewish usurers in the 12th century, but people are already talking about them. Yet those things have real consequences in the world. Like, part of what I'm arguing here is that the construction of Islam as something consumable may exist in high theological rhetoric or even in images, but has real impact. And this is sort of the book I'm working on right now, has real impact on the way Christians create treaties and understand their material relations with the Islamic world, which is to say, we can defraud, raid, steal from Muslims because they are available to some degree as resources to us. We will put their infidel economy to good work here. Doesn't, there's some real resonances there with colonialism as well as a kind of extractive economy. In the mind of theologians, at least, the Christian economy was also extractive. It was about doing good with bad. So that's really interesting. Can we talk a little bit about Jewish-Muslim relations, or draw it out? You did more than I did, but how might we talk about that, or how might we teach people about that, or how differently would that story go than, say, the story with Christians, which we've seen, which at least I foregrounded?
Yeah, no, I'd love for us to talk about that. I want to respond to one thing you said about the kind of the strategic uses of the rhetoric of difference, of the strategic misunderstandings or misrepresentations of the other, because obviously rhetoric imagery affects the way people regard and interact with different religious confessions. But there's also a lot that's simply self-interest and strategy. I tend to talk about a real interplay of interest and culture and intellectual assumptions, where one doesn't necessarily predominate over the other. But I open that piece that I referred to in the Oxford Handbook by quoting two different letters written in the same decade by Pope Gregory VII. One, all the rhetoric about Jews, Christians, heretics being in league with each other and being allied to the devil and minions of Satan. And then, just within a year or two, he writes to a Muslim ruler in North Africa saying, hey, we all worship the same God and we all speak the same language and we read the same text and there's no reason we can't get along because the Pope wants to create a trading partnership. So, you know, the Pope is able to get very, very polemically vicious and very, very diplomatically tolerant, depending upon why he's writing as well as to whom he's writing for. So we should bear in mind that people are conditioned by their cultures and what they read, but they're not necessarily slaves to it.
Right.
But in terms of Jewish-Muslim relations, I mean, obviously, the first response that I give whenever I'm asked this, and I would like us to talk about teaching a little bit too, but whether I'm asked it by a colleague or a member of the general public or a student is where, when, what decade, what city, sometimes what
Right.
block, because obviously these things vary greatly. I mean, there, you know, the famous textbook that many of us have used and still value, Under Crescent and Cross by Mark Cohen of Princeton. I mean, a tremendously learned text. And, you know, kind of one of the arguments, I hope this doesn't seem like a vast oversimplification, is overall Jews did better under Muslim rule than under Christian rule, if we look at the totality of the Middle Ages. You know, sometimes people really do want us to generalize.
Yeah.
But having said that, you know, if someone had to say, if you were a Jew who had to live sometime in the Middle Ages somewhere under some rule, where or when would it be? You know, I might say, well, you know, Fatimid Cairo looked like a pretty reasonable place, and I can't think of a lot of any Christian period or place that would be better. But having said that, we saw that Yehuda Halevi had to flee Granada, Muslim Andalusia, to go to Christian Toledo because a new bunch of rulers arrived who were reversing the relatively tolerant policies of their predecessors. And overwhelmingly, I think what I would say is that tolerance is really not a good word to use in this context. You know, most medieval polities and confessions and individuals did not have ideas of tolerance similar to modern ideas. People did not have rights. People had privileges that were negotiated according to their membership in various communities. And so it's really a question of what do you value and under what circumstances are you most free to observe what you value. If you're a secular Jewish merchant who wants to be able to do your business, raise your family, you don't care that much about scholarship, learning, piety, you might choose one answer. If you're a scholar who desperately wants to be able to study Talmud uninterrupted and be supported by your community, the answer would be very different. So Jewish-Muslim relations, I mean, fundamentally, you can answer this better than I can, determined by the local political authorities' interpretation of Dima status and imposition of Dima status. You know, was the jizya a token thing? The tax demanded of non-Muslims, was it barely token and collected in a humane fashion, as many Muslim instructions say, or was it designed to burden and impoverish? It changed from time to time, place to place. But in the Muslim world, one thing was very true, which is Jews and Muslims tended to literally speak the same language. And I should emphasize that the Jewish vernacular was generally the vernacular of the communities around them in almost every circumstance, with the possible exception of Jews in early Norman England who spoke the French of their Norman invaders, but not immediately the Anglo-Saxon of some of their neighbors. But as you were just saying, and I totally endorse what you just said, shared culture, shared language, being neighbors, you know, sharing midwives and nursing does not necessarily make for constant peace and tolerance. I mean, you know, the story of the Holocaust very much shows that, you know, the notoriously blood-chilling book Neighbors showed that people whose families had lived together for generations were willing to turn on each other and see their neighbors murdered and participate in it.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think the way we often talk about Jewish existence in the Islamic world in the pre-modern period is often in a tone of surprise, as though, gosh, I can't believe they got along so well then, as opposed to now, or This surely they lived in the breach of what they believed. What's helpful, I think, for people to remember a couple of things, and some of this is research that's relatively new. One is that, the story of deicide doesn't exist in the Quran. There's no argument fundamentally about a Jewish sin, which it traps Christian theologians when thinking about Judaism in a way that doesn't Muslim theologians. But there is an image in the Quran of Jewish scheming against Jesus, which is kind of interesting. That same passage that says Jews schemed against Jesus also says this was God's plan, that God is the greatest schemer of all. It's a passage I find really fascinating. There's in the Quran there are multiple representations of Jews. They range from saying things like they're just like us, they are our people, they are the best people on earth. Other moments in the Quran where it says things like, if you want to know if this revelation is true, go talk to the Jews. They know. They can remind you, they can tell you what this is all about. They're constant, Muslims see themselves as Jews to some degree in the sense that they're, living out an Old Testament story in real time or something. And at the same time, there's also lots of vituperative text in the Quran, which has been understood by Muslim scholars at the time as speaking to very specific incidents with the Jewish community in Yathrib, which would become Medina. So there's good work to be done there in the Quran. I think the dangerous term here is dhimma, because it's and this, I'd send everyone to read this relatively recent article by Luke Yarborough about the Pact of Omar, which is an 11th or maybe I think a 11th, maybe 10th century forgery to some degree that poses as an early Islamic text. We have no evidence that the Pact of Omar existed before that it was ever written. I often read it with my students with a kind of, and none of them after close inspection can believe this is true. It purports to be a surrender treaty between the Christians of such and such city and the Muslims, but they already seem to know a hell of a lot about each other. And one of the ways to think about the Pact of Omar is that it belongs to a later period, 10th, 11th century, in which there's a great deal of Jewish and Christian conversion to Islam. And suddenly a process of what we might call ethnogenesis or racialization or confessionalization, choose the term you will, is at work in this text where it is trying to differentiate through the things that you indicated, Sarah, like dress, behavior, what languages you read, suddenly become confessionalizing things where they weren't in an earlier period. You're right. We know very little about the jizya. That text that you cited for us, Beladuri, very famously says the Muslims Islamized North Africa, and it's the intensitive. It's of the word Islam. They made Islamic the North Africa. But I think the appropriate reading of this is pacified, because the word Islam in these early texts doesn't mean much. Doesn't yet see itself as a separate religion or as something one converts to necessarily, so much as a disposition to the world, a disposition towards a certain kind of leadership, and a sort of a pact, let's say. And they do often use that word even in Arabic, bakt, which is straight out of Latin, right? So they see themselves as doing something very Roman, I think, in Baladuri, which makes them such an interesting text. Dhimma, I think, is again like one of these terms that we could go back and teach our students a little differently about how to use that term. It has this, very polemical kind of modern usage where it's sort of like Muslims have always been oppressive of Jews and Christians since the very beginning, as this text shows us. Therefore, if they're nicer to Christians and Jews than Christians are in the Middle Ages, that was just a temporary thing. They're showing their true essence now. And I get nervous around those terms. I suddenly start getting very academic and qualifying.
Yeah, okay, you and I could talk about this forever, and we want to leave time for Q&A. I do want to say just one quick thing about what you said towards the beginning, about Jews scheming.
Mm.
And in fact, I mean, there have been a lot of publications lately concomitant with the rise of, whether you want to call it anti-Semitism or Judeophobia or anti-Jewish rhetoric, whatever, about, I mean, there are many assertions that at its heart, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. And this is something that I'm working on right now, the association of Jews with conspiracy. And all I wanted to point out, as I said kind of in the beginning of my remarks, that throughout the Middle Ages, and we're talking about a millennium plus, Jews lived either under Muslim or Christian rule, which means that Jews were inherently politically weakened. There were individual Jews that exercised power, which was always a source of anxiety, if not rage, and often got them in trouble. But politically, as a community, Jews were weakened. At the same time, Christians especially were terrified of their power, and Muslims, of course, were always worried about how Jews might express resistance in some way. And that's where the conspiracy theorism comes from, that it's something created by the overlords. You weaken someone and then you impute a great deal of power to them. And so it's got to be power exercised in secret, nefariously, in non-evident ways. So that is, again, one of the differences, to go back to our earlier kind of little exchange, parallels or divergences between Christian images of Jews and Muslims, that Christians portray Jews as scheming and conspiratorial, and often they were alleged to be conspiring with Muslims against Christians, because there was always fear of this Muslim military power, Muslim numbers within some Christian borders in Iberia, for example, but Muslim military power beyond the borders of Christendom. Whereas Muslims were more portrayed as brutal and militaristic and violent. Yes. Those are subtle differences, but this idea of Jewish conspiratorial tendencies, still, right up through the Hollywood and through,
Right.
led to Jewish control of American foreign policy and immigration policy, etc. That really goes back to this. A lot of the images go back to illustrations of scripture where the Jews were held to be plotting against Jesus, even though historically, of course, it was Romans who executed Jesus. Probably,
that's right.
Probably.
I mean, what's interesting about that is that somehow Muslims have gotten the Christian reinterpretation of that passage from the Bible, which is also kind of a fascinating moment of sharing, right?
But maybe we should stop and let Tom shoot a bunch of questions our way, to the extent.
Yeah.
I think we agreed that we have until about 3:30, right? So we have a little more than 15 minutes.
I mean, I asked Chris, and technically it's scheduled to go to 4, but I think we get to see how it goes, but depending on your availability, of course. But yeah, we did have one question in the chat, and then I'm happy to invite the other people here to either type a question in the chat or raise your hand. I'm not sure if we can see hands, but maybe if you're able to raise. I'm not sure how the interface works with raising hands, but or maybe type it in the chat would be. I don't know. We can see how it goes.
There's both a chat and a Q&A, which is a little confusing.
There's a Q&A. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So oh, I see. Yeah, there are quite a few questions here in the Q&A. Yeah. Oh, so who was first? Okay, so I think Andrea Castingray was first. Are you guys able to see the question, or?
I do have it open now.
Yeah.
Let me see. Is it
quite a long question?
Yeah. Oh, I see. All right. You know what? I think rather than answer that at length, I'll say that the recent address I gave at the Medieval Academy had a long history about the question of the Seal of Solomon in Muslim and Jewish and Christian cultures, and that is available on the MAA YouTube channel and will also be published in Speculum next year. So I won't answer at great length. I'll just say that, in fact, Jews and Muslims and Christians had a variety of names for uses of, deployments of the six-pointed star, and at different times and places it was or was not necessarily associated with Hebrew scripture, with Solomon, with Muslim astrology, etc. So it's a complicated story, and I go through some of it again in that address on the MAA YouTube channel and coming out in Speculum.
I mean, there's so many great examples of this kind of sharing. Another great one is the use in Castile of various Islamic mottos and slogans like "La ilaha illallah," there's no victor but God, Al-Yumn wal Iqbal. It appears all over Castilian Mozarab texts, good luck and good fortune to you, or it's sort of like it's fascinating how things get moved back and forth, and there's a lot we could do. I mean, the sort of Hebrew poetry of the 11th century is another great example of sharing and not at the same time.
The next question, I actually might insert a moderator's privilege because Eugene Clay had this great question about Muhammad being often portrayed as a sexual libertine, and maybe that explaining the way he's portrayed in the Aula Gothica. And I was just, when you were talking about that and also showing the image of Dante, I was reflecting on, I've been rereading Leah Devon's Shape of Sex recently, and she actually does some really interesting work with from the same Hereford map, showing the among the monstrous races, the hermaphroditic or intersexed uh, Jew and Muslim uh, among these monstrous races. And she kind of raises the idea of the carnality of Islam,
Right.
and then doesn't address as much the Jewish figure there. But it's interesting to think about that depiction for both, given that you guys are the conversation we're having. But then talks about how this kind of aligned with Peter the Venerable's idea of Islam being a hybrid religion, sort of monstrously fabricated from earlier uh, traditions, and how this maps onto the body, and how there's sort of the Muslim is libertine and sodomite and perverted, right? And
Right.
and then that fits. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on intersexual, interreligious sexual relations, and why the sort of the Muslim as sexual predator idea that Nuremberg and others have talked about, and so it's really interesting to think about that, and in the light of, I mean, what Eugene's
Yeah.
question is drawing on, I had never seen the Allegotica before, but thinking about how all these different uh,
Lovely.
images reflecting these Christian attitudes towards Islam, right? And then mix the Judaism in their views of Judaism as well. It's
Yeah.
a lot to work with regarding these stereotypical views, and how it actually maps onto policy making,
Yeah.
right? And trials, right, of like Muslim men who are basically lynched for alleged sexual relations with women, Christian women, stuff like this, which I've seen
Yes,
a lot
no,
of evidence of in the
that's totally
Democratic.
great. Yes, I think this is a great example. I think of the way social and intellectual history intersect in fascinating ways. So, Eugene, my argument isn't that there is no carnal image, or it's surprising that they choose a carnal image of Islam, so much as why, in that context, is that the one emphasized among all of the options, right? You have the Heresia, like you're putting Muhammad in this anti-divine pantheon, and you put him in eating and drinking. And I just found that choice interesting. You're absolutely right that there's something totally unsurprising about it because it's familiar. I believe the earliest references to Muhammad as licentious come from uh, you know Byzantine polemics against Islam, written in Arabic, right? So this is early Christian responses to Islam, and what one gets a sense of in these early texts that end up in places like Marsaba is Christians in debates with Muslims. These are some of the texts that I think Sarah was citing as well, early Christian responses and Jewish responses to the rise of Islam. Some groups profiting, some groups failing, and this kind of complex of Jews, Christians, varieties of Christians, some succeeding, some failing. Among those that find themselves under Muslim rule, we find all these great kind of lay debates. These are written about, these many of these have been translated, and I use them in class all the time. Uh, about how to debate with Muslims. And this is one of the things that they kind of go for the jugular with regularly in these early polemics against Islam, is like, if you really want to get a Muslim that you meet on the street into a debate and make them angry, say, bring up child molestation, right? Is essentially what it boils down to. Like, this is how you can get them. So it's sort of like fascinating because it draws on the Islamic tradition itself. That is the marriage of Muhammad and Aisha, or more often it is the story of uh, God, Zayd and of his nephew Zayd, whose wife is who Muhammad takes away. These are actual episodes from the Islamic tradition. They are, I would say, soft spots in the Islamic tradition, because even Muslims seem to have a kind of, in the early tradition, have a kind of confusion about how to make sense of these stories. These enter into polemic. These Eastern traditions are translated into the Western European world almost in a deracinated way, torn out of their context and repurposed much later for totally different ends, and then find themselves in places like Castile, in Catalonia, or even in France, being invoked in entirely new ways. So for me, I find this coming in and out of a kind of polemics of Islam as carnal really fascinating as well.
Yeah, if I could just add a couple of words. I mean, first of all, in terms of the Alagotica, if the desire had been to emphasize Muhammad's sexual licentiousness, I mean, I think this is what you were driving at, Hussein. One would expect to see him under castitas rather than sobrietas.
Right.
And there was, in fact, this long polemical tradition of associating Muslims with drunkenness and gluttony. So that makes sense. That image fits within it. But just to sort of, again, contrast it with Christian polemic against and about Jews, Jewish women were portrayed as sexually predatory in a way. The Jewish seductress, who seduced the Christian cleric, the vulnerable Christian man, and led him away from Christianity by her beauty and her wiles. But again, that sort of plays into the trope of sort of scheming and secret. Jewish men tended to be feminized. I don't think that the myth of Jewish male men menstruating the flux of blood was very widespread. We find it in some medical texts, but it certainly reflects a tendency to feminize Jewish men. So they tended not to be presented as predatory threats to Christian women, except insofar as they exercised economic power and the power of employers. So that, most of the host desecration libels will show a poor Christian woman going to a Jewish man and saying, will you lend me money? And he'll say, only if you bring me a host so that I can then desecrate it. But those almost never are accompanied by allegations that there's kind of sexual compulsion there, which is interesting. It's just they had their kind of grooves, and they stuck in them. And whether it is because there was some recognition that, there would have been a lot of reason to allege that Jewish men seduced and impregnated Jewish Christian women, because in fact, there's a lot of evidence that Jewish men who had Christian female servants did sometimes have sex with them, and evidence that, Jewish men say, oh, you look down on me because my mother was a Christian and she was my father's servant. So it could have happened, but it just never made into the rhetoric, whether it was too threatening, whether it sort of just didn't really suit the idea of this scheming and not assertive in a particular way trope of Jews. It's, I need to think about it more clearly.
I love that.
Yeah, so I took the liberty. I guess there's an issue where the attendees couldn't see the Q&A. So I went ahead and I put the question that Andrea had asked in the Q&A that we didn't read out. We have a couple questions, but there's one that dovetails from Louis Zweig, that dovetails with what you guys were just discussing. So maybe we can have you guys talk about that one next, and then we can go back to Serena Koersteiner's question about showing images about the Prophet Muhammad in among students, especially when you're untendered. I'm kind of wondering how to do. She's wondering how to do that. But yeah, so I pasted Lewis's question into the chat that everyone can hopefully see. But essentially asking about this association with luxury. I think you guys have already talked about some aspects of this, but maybe there's wondering about the mysterious painting of Mithras.
I would, there's been a beautiful book written about the Alagotica, Louis, and I'm happy to send you an incredibly careful study of all the images by the curator. And then there's been an excellent essay in Gesta by Marius Hockness, which was really helpful to me in thinking about it as well. So I would point you towards those. I'm not really an expert in the Aula Gotica itself, and I have to say, like, what I've read, it is fascinating in and of itself. And Marius has this wonderful reading, which I'm drawing on, about the relationship between the northern and southern parts of the um, building. Do you want me to? I can touch quickly on this. Christian literary lives of Muhammad. Is he depicted similarly? What's interesting is we might look at the early. They've been translated by Kenneth Wolfe from Latin. For those of you who are looking for things to use in class, these are the early lives of Muhammad, 8th, 9th century, from Latin. We might also think about the myth of Pelayo and how that's rendered, how Muhammad gets or Islam gets portrayed in there. What's interesting about these early Latin lives of Muhammad, let's say they are the first things written in Latin about Islam, is that whoever is writing them is reading the Quran or has access to a translation of the Quran, or somebody who knows the Quran, because there are references to entire passages, or chapters, surahs, stories, all of which are rendered with no acknowledgement of what Muslims might actually say about themselves. So this sort of, we find both the kind of Islam as the embodiment of carnality, as the inversion of Christianity, as a Roman paganism still. There is I think somebody might even put it in the chat, in the famous episode of Pelayo, the Muslim king is a Caesar. Islam doesn't really even exist in that story, and he wants to essentially have sex with Pelayo on his throne in the middle of the story. So yeah, there are some good examples there, but in the same way that I'm saying betray, that at least 9th century monastics had a really good understanding of Islam, a surprisingly good understanding of the Islamic tradition.
Great. So I think we only have about 5 minutes left.
I would like to address that question. I think it was from Serena, about showing images
Oh
of
yeah, good.
Muhammad. Because I imagine a lot of people are wondering about this. And, I understand the need to be concerned and careful. And my first answer is, you really have to know your own student body. I have found that the student body at Stony Brook, which is very, very, very diverse. It's not an elite school. Okay, I'm prejudiced about this. I think it's the best educational bargain in America. And so we don't have students from privileged economic backgrounds, a lot of first generation students, a lot of immigrant students. They tend to be very, very focused on getting their degrees and getting jobs and supporting themselves, and not overly politicized. So I have never had particular problems. I explain to them, students, ahead of time, that there are precedents in Muslim illumination, medieval illumination, especially Persian, that they did show Muhammad, and that I will be showing various images. I do give students, if this will be very upsetting to you, I give them the option to step out, because I see absolutely no reason in creating a great deal of opposition. But I will say, if you choose to step out, please let me know, and I will give you written descriptions of what we're seeing, and make sure that you get the education that came along with the image. But I don't encourage everybody to go ahead if you feel that you will have a very different experience with the students in your school.
I do much the same thing. I teach a class almost every year on Western European views of Islam. And on the very first day, I bring in polemical images of Muhammad. I lay them face down on the students' desks. We talk a little bit about, the Islamic tradition, images of Muhammad, and essentially say what Sarah has said, after both dispelling the idea that Muslims somehow don't Islam doesn't allow images or images of Muhammad, and then that there are traditions within Islam in which it is perfectly acceptable to draw images of, and moments where we have plenty of them. I don't show them to the students without a warning, in essence, that is the same for Sarah's. And I will say anecdotally, in all my time of teaching with lots and lots of Muslim students at the University of Michigan, where I think we have the largest population of Muslim students in the country, and Arab or Muslim students in the country. And here at Yale, I have a surprisingly large number of Muslim students show up in my classes as well. Um, I've only had one student who, well, I should say the last time I taught it, I had two students refuse to turn the page over in the class, which was completely acceptable with me, and just listened to the discussion but didn't want to look at the images. And one of them came up to me afterwards and said, I really respect this, but I think this is going to be too hard for me. And I recognized that it was simply going to be too hard a discussion to talk for 13 weeks and write about polemical images of Islam if it made you uncomfortable. That's just not the topic for you, and that's okay. But I think making it a choice is the key here. We want to teach in plural spaces. We want to teach in spaces where, and particularly we work on subjects like religion, our presumption shouldn't be a kind of aggressive secularism, that the only correct worldview is our own or the critical one.
So maybe there's time for this one last question from I'm not sure who it was presented anonymously in the chat Q&A, but I put it into the general chat that everyone can see, but essentially asking Hussein about this emergence within Islam of seeing itself as a separate religion.
Yeah, this is a really lively debate within Islamic studies. And there are some people, it starts off with the very famous debates about Hagerism, the book by Patricia Crona and Michael Cook, who was my professor at Princeton many years ago, and I'm a great admirer of his. And when is it that Muslims start to see themselves as or start to define themselves against others? And Richard Bullitt famously looked at biographical dictionaries to find out when people converted to Islam, and when it became a kind of confessional identity or important to people to say choose sides. It is often dated sometime between the 8th and 9th centuries. I find all this scholarship highly speculative. I think what we could say is, because we're all looking through a mirror darkly, as Sarah says, we can see the dynamics at work in our texts. And one of the things we should teach our students, or ideally are teaching them, is that our texts are not windows into these worlds. They are problems upon problems. And one of the problems we have in our text is the vocabulary we use. I think I said this recently in an article. I forget where I published it, but in essence, that the real challenge for us moving forward as scholars of these topics is, what do we mean by Jew, Christian, and Muslim? How do we use those terms in a way that is both, critical and understands that these are dynamic terms, but at the same time, they are terms that are at work in our text.
Yeah, if I could jump in also, some people listening might know this, but this might come as kind of a new idea to other people, that nor is it clear when Judaism and Christianity became distinguished from each other.
Yes.
I mean, there's a book, again, dating back to quite a few decades ago now, by Alan Siegel, Rebecca's Children, that argued that Judaism was born at the same time as and in dialogue with Christianity. Obviously, there are aspects of what we call Judaism that far predate the lifetime of Jesus and the writing of the Christian scriptures. So there are many Jewish studies scholars who would not agree with that, but certainly scholars of Jewish-Christian relations. I mean, we have to acknowledge that the first Christians considered themselves Jews. It is by no means clear that Jesus considered himself a Christian. He lived and presumably died as a Jewish person. And when these communities began to distinguish themselves from each other is an ongoing discussion. I mean, there's a wonderful multi-year project funded by Katharina Hayden of Barron and David Nuremberg of the Institute for Advanced Study, called Co-Producing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which looks at the many different ways in which all three of these so-called Abrahamic faiths were constantly creating themselves in dialogue with, knowledge of, reaction to, intersection with the other ones. So, where do we pinpoint, Judaism and Christianity are not exactly the same? It depends, what you're looking for in terms of law, in terms of liturgy. the early Christian move to say like, oh, we can't let Passover and Easter fall at the same time. And if they happen to by our calculations, then we have to move Easter because we don't want this confusion to happen. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know if the homilies of John Chrysostom should be called against the Jews or against Judaizing Christians or even against my congregation who are doing things I don't like.
Right. That's perfect. That's great.
I think that's a great way to wrap this wonderful conversation up. Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much to our speakers. I just wanted to let everyone know that this has been recorded, and so I think that you will be receiving a link to the, or we don't know yet, right? We're deciding, right? Yeah. There's been a question whether it's been recorded or not, so I'm not sure. Yeah, so we're gonna see if it's available. Yeah. But stay tuned. We'll let you know. But anyway, thank you so much to you both and to everyone for your wonderful questions.
Thank you, Tom, and to be continued, Hussein.